Here at CBR, the only thing we like more than a good fan theory is a good fan theory that actually gets confirmed. Who married Peggy Carter and fathered her children has always been a mystery in the MCU, and even the Smithsonian didn't have any ideas the last time Steve Rogers visited. The good news is now we finally have confirmation, but the bad news is that this only leaves us with even more questions. In Captain America, the First Avenger, we learned that Steve Rogers was in love with a woman named Peggy Carter, and it's not hard to see why. Peggy was brave, strong, and of course, jaw-droppingly beautiful, but unfortunately, their romance seemed pretty doomed when Steve plunged his plane into the ocean. Sure, it saved the day, but being frozen in the ocean really makes it hard to maintain a romantic relationship. Long-distance love. When Steve was finally woken up, he realized tons of time had passed and he was more than a little bit late for his date with Peggy. Still, he wanted to know what had happened to her since he last saw her. Now, thanks to a handy exhibit at the Smithsonian Institute, he learned Peggy had gotten married. Despite Peggy being such an important person, her husband was listed as unknown, and it only said that he was saved by Captain America and that he and Peggy had 2 children together, a son and a daughter. Yeah, Steve Rogers believed he had saved someone's life who ended up marrying the love of his life. That's the kind of thing that'll make someone bitter. Maybe bitter enough to make out with his loved one's niece, but let's not dwell on that any longer than necessary. Who was Peggy Carter's husband has always been a mystery, but it certainly seemed like this was one of the questions answered by Avengers Endgame. At the end of the movie, we saw Steve Rogers head back in time to return the Infinity Stones to their rightful places throughout history. Only, instead of coming back, he decided to stay in the past so he and Peggy could pick up where he left off. Now, on the surface, it certainly seemed like this meant Peggy and Steve had finally gotten their chance to be together. Surely they'd gotten married, had 2 children, and lived happily ever after, but there were 2 things that held us back from declaring this as official. The first is that time travel and multiple universes make this whole situation complex. The second is that this is Marvel we're talking about. One of the things we both love and feel frustrated by is how they can change things on a whim. So we painfully waited weeks after Endgame came out to be able to say in our best Maury Povich voice that Steve Rogers, you are the father of Peggy Carter's children. At least that's what writers Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely have to say about the issue. They admit Marvel Studios may switch things up, but they wrote Endgame fully intending for Steve Rogers to have been Peggy's husband all along. They were also kind enough to immediately provide us with plenty of additional information for us to speculate wildly about. According to Marcus, this does introduce the idea, though, that there are 2 children who have somewhat Super Soldier DNA. Okay, that's pretty darn exciting, especially since the MCU is running low on superheroes after Endgame. Depending on how good you are with math and dates, you might have realized that this would make Steve and Peggy's kids in their 60s. But don't forget about that Super Soldier Serum influenced DNA. After all, Steve Rogers looked old the last time we saw him, but he was 123 years old, so all things considered, we think he looks great for his age. If his appearance is anything to go by, his kids probably get carded when they try to qualify for seniors discounts. Now, we just really want to know where these kids are and what kind of people they are. Oh, and of course, we want to know how many of Steve's superpowers they ended up with. It may have seemed strange that Steve handed over his shield and the title of Captain America over to Sam Wilson instead of one of his own children, but there could be quite a few explanations for this. Maybe his kids really aren't superhuman in any way, and they prefer living quiet lives in relative obscurity, or maybe they just aren't into dressing up in costumes and fighting bad guys. But don't worry, because there are still plenty of ways these kids, and by kids we mean people in their 60s, could become heroes in their own right if they're not already. In the comic books, Sam also becomes the new Captain America for a period of time. While he's learning to be the new Cap, he also trains a new Falcon. In the comic books, this character is named Joaquin Torres, and he gets kidnapped by a group called Sons of the Serpent. We know, it's a really cool name, but trust us, they're bad guys. Sam Wilson, as Captain America, finds out that Joaquin is being experimented on to make a human-bird hybrid. Yeah, if that isn't a mad scientist experiment, we don't know what is. Anyway, Sam saves the day, and then he starts training Joaquin to be the new Falcon and his sidekick. Could it be possible that one of Captain America's children could become the new Falcon with some help from Sam? Things change dramatically from the comic books to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. After all, it seems pretty obvious they're setting up Lila Barton, Clint Barton's daughter, to be the next Hawkeye, but in the comic books, the next female Hawkeye is a woman named Kate Bishop, who isn't related to Clint, she's just a big fan. So it's possible one of Steve's children could become a new Falcon and work with his or her father and his new protege. Let's take a moment to consider some lesser-known characters from the Marvel library. In the early days of the MCU, Marvel Studios played it pretty safe by sticking to characters most people were familiar with, even if they weren't comic book fans. Everyone knows who Captain America and the Incredible Hulk are, but that's both a good and bad thing. It's a good thing because it gets people to go to the theater, but it's a bad thing because it could be difficult to write such characters due to audience expectations. Just think about the scream of a million comic book fans when they found out the Skrulls and Captain Marvel were the good guys. Madness! When you bring a popular character like Spider-Man to the big screen, writers are challenged to stay true to the comic book character to a big extent. But one of the benefits of using lesser-known characters is that there's more room to play with. Look at how much everyone loves the Guardians of the Galaxy when they've only been around for the blink of an eye in the comic books compared to heroes like Captain America and Iron Man. We have a couple of lesser-known heroes we think could be tweaked to fit the children of Steve Rogers and Peggy Carter perfectly. Since female heroes are finally getting some recognition in the MCU, let's talk about the possible identity of Steve's daughter. In the comics, a character named Kathy Webster is faced with an insidious enemy all too familiar to many of us: student loan payments. To help pay for school, she signs up for some unscrupulous experiments from a scientist who wants to program her to hate all men. Fortunately, she's able to overcome that brainwashing and then is left with her body in peak physical condition, just like Captain America. She becomes a hero who goes by the name Free Spirit and trains with Steve Rogers himself. Then we have Jack Harrison, better known as Jack Flag. He's a big Captain America fan who found him an inspiring hero. Jack found out his local law enforcement was working along with criminals and decided to do something about it. He started training in order to take them down on his own, and then started calling himself Jack Flag because he wanted to make Captain America proud, which is pretty heartwarming. When Steve Rogers needs help, Free Spirit and Jack Flag are among those he turns to. So it's not too crazy to think that the MCU's Steve Rogers might have two kids with enhanced physical abilities following in his footsteps. Now that we've talked about what these kids could be like, let's talk about how we could end up seeing them. Marvel's been quiet about what we can expect from Phase 4, which kicks off following the movie Spider-Man Far From Home. We know they're going to be making sequels to Black Panther and Doctor Strange, but we aren't sure when they're going to be released. Now that once-fired director James Gunn is back at the helm of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, the movie is in the works, but it could be a while before it hits theaters. After getting the boot from Disney, he went over to the dark side, and by that we mean that he's directing the DC movie Suicide Squad 2, yeah. Then there are the faraway projects we're anxious to see. Could we meet Steve Rogers' kids on the big screen? Sure, seems like a possibility even the writers of Avengers Endgame would like to see, but we also know Disney is working on creating other content involving some of our favorite Marvel characters. They've already announced shows starring Sam Wilson and Bucky Barnes, Scarlet Witch and Vision, and of course, Loki. These shows are going to be available on the new Disney Plus streaming service. Even if they're in peak physical condition, the kids of Steve Rogers could be in their 60s in the present-day MCU. That does seem like a rather odd time in life to decide to be a superhero. Never mind just their superpowers, we're interested to know what the personalities of these characters are like. Sharon Carter talked about being greatly inspired by her Aunt Peggy, and we all know Sharon grew up to be a talented agent and a generally awesome person, time travel uncle smooching notwithstanding. Peggy and Steve both have strong personalities and morals, and it would be interesting to learn what kind of parents they became. Of course, it's also possible their kids could go the other way, or one or both of them could rebel. What if, instead of becoming heroes, they become villains? Using your powers for good isn't always as easy as Steve Rogers makes it look, and this would definitely be a big twist. What do you think about the fact that Steve Rogers was the father of Peggy Carter's children all along? And what do you think the future has in store for them in the MCU? Let us know what you think in the comments section below, and then click subscribe for more great videos. Bye for now.